Hi, I'm Chris Richardson, and I'd like to talk about Batman, gender, and sexuality today. Unfortunately, we can't be getting together in Atlanta during Dragon Con for the Comics and Popular Arts conference that goes on every year. I really wish we could. Instead, I'm recording the talk that I would have given there, and with the next best thing to cosplay, I suppose, which is my Batman and Joker cutouts. So, as I said, this is the talk I would have given. I suppose a little bit of background before we get started. I'm Chris Richardson again, the chair of Communication Studies and the program director for popular culture at Young Harris College, which is a small liberal arts school just outside of Atlanta. And I've been working on this project for a little bit that's about to come out now as a book with Routledge called Batman and the Joker, Contested Sexuality in Popular Culture. That comes out October 2020, and I'll put a link at the end of this video in case anyone's interested. There's a discount code you can use with Routledge. But that project is about thinking through Batman and representations, primarily in comics, and how gender works to play a significant role in it, of course, in various ways that we might not have originally anticipated or that we might not think about, especially in classic renditions of Batman from the early 40s until now. So that's what the project is about. I also host a podcast called This Is Not a Pipe Podcast, and I just want to mention that because I've had the privilege of talking to some really great scholars. Frederick Kohlert is in charge of the whole production of a number of books coming out on gender, sexuality, and comics. And so I was able to talk to him. I was able to talk to Will Brooker, Ramsey Fawaz, Nick Susanis, who wrote Unflattening, as well as a number of other really great scholars. And so I just want to say thank you to them, because without those conversations with This Is Not a Pipe podcast, I definitely wouldn't have been able to construct the kinds of hopefully nuanced and well-supported arguments that are now present in that larger project, and that I'll share a little bit with you today. So I want to think about a certain character that I'm sure very few people are familiar with when it comes to Batman. I definitely wasn't until I started looking back over the very early issues that came out starting in 1939 and then going into the 40s and so on. And I came across this character in issue number 5 of Batman, 1941, named Queenie. Queenie, unlike virtually all of the people around Batman, sees almost immediately that Batman and Bruce Wayne are probably the same person. He happens to have cut his chin shaving that day, and she instantly notices that Batman and Bruce Wayne both have this little nick on their chin, and that can't just be a coincidence. So the character doesn't get really well developed. In fact, it's kind of interesting that we're introduced to her, and almost immediately she dies. But two interesting things happen, at least I thought they were interesting, and that they've helped me think through some of the bigger issues that I want to highlight today about Batman, gender, and sexuality. So this character, who herself doesn't quite fit into gender norms. I mean, her name is Queenie. She is part of the Joker's crew, but of course the Joker quickly turns on her, and she's left to die on this boat, basically. But even more important than that, and her ability to identify the connection between Bruce Wayne and Batman, she saves Batman's life. And that doesn't seem like a huge deal, but when you think about the contemporary representations of Batman as pretty much invulnerable, yes, he's perhaps died in various situations only to come back. You know, there's a number of special comics, Final Crisis among them, that we see Batman sort of die, but maybe not, or not really. Even The Dark Knight with Frank Miller, we kind of see that, but of course we also don't. And it gets murky. But she saves Batman's life, and what I realized is that this trope happens again and again. We probably think about Robin saving Batman's life, as he does in virtually every comic in the beginning, but what it points to more broadly, what I think, is a sort of challenge to the traditional manly man that we were kind of prescribed for a long time now, but especially in the 30s and 40s, up until today. And those kinds of characters don't need help, especially from women, especially from people who are less powerful than them. And yet, as I was reading through these early issues of Batman, over and over again, he's right about to die. And in fact, most of the time, he doesn't even know it. Someone's going to shoot him from behind, somebody's going to set a trap for him that kills him instantly, and Robin or Queenie or a number of other characters are always kind of jumping in to save him. Not so different from like Inspector Gadget type of situations. The interesting thing about that is that we're introduced to what appears to be a really vulnerable character, and yet he's also quite heroic, and he's the sort of quintessential man of the 1930s when he's smoking a pipe and when he's in his lounge jacket and in his mansion and discussing with Robin why he should or shouldn't do various things. He's always telling women and young people how they should act, very much like Leave It to Beaver in later decades. And of course, that trope continues as well. But that's not so interesting to me. I mean, that I think is what we would expect from a character who is a representation of a sort of powerful, traditional male character. What we don't expect so much is this vulnerability and this need for others to help save his life. I mean, Batman would be dead in almost all of the issues that occurred, especially early on, if it wasn't for somebody intervening and saving him, which says a lot about the competition between different discourses at the time. I want to think about a few frameworks that we could use, broadly under the category of queer theory, but of course that's a difficult term to pin down. I wouldn't trust anybody who says that they can define queer theory, especially in a sentence or two. I think very much like Raymond Williams talking about culture, it's also, especially now, one of the most difficult words in the English language because it varies so much depending on context. I also want to highlight that there's this whole sort of gay debate about Batman that stemmed from work. I'm sure a lot of people watching this, if you're interested in comics, you know about this, but Frederick Wortham was a psychiatrist who dealt with a number of people in New York, young people, and cautioned about the dangers of comics. And he actually highlights Batman and Robin as a homosexual relationship or a dream for homosexuals that they could start to see and then question and then become the dreaded homosexual of the 1950s that people obviously weren't open to. I mean, it was considered a mental disease in the DSM up until the 60s and 70s, and so that was a big threat to people. And so that was a sort of hidden subtext of Batman that Frederick Wortham highlights. Of course, I don't think Bill Finger or Bob Kane, who created Batman, had that in mind per se, although they obviously became aware of it when these debates started happening and then when people started burning these books and really vilifying people who would read comics, especially people who would read certain comics like Batman and Robin and be inspired to lead a non-traditional lifestyle. And so there's this sort of subtext that I think a lot of us are familiar with now, that maybe Batman and Robin are gay, or maybe there's this subtext that there's a sort of hidden meaning to their relationship. There are a number of websites you can find, there are a number of images you can find that question this, sometimes jokingly, sometimes seriously, sometimes in a sort of liberating way, sometimes definitely not. And yet, that's not really what I want to get at in this talk. I don't want to assert, I don't think it's necessarily right or wrong, but I definitely don't want to assert that Batman is secretly gay or closeted homosexual. I think that really limits how we can read him. But I do very much think that Batman is queer, and I want to explain a little bit what I mean by that. So, queer can mean a number of things, and queer theory and queer analysis can do a number of things, but I think the most powerful and the most general thing it can do is just question the traditions of normalcy that we take for granted when we're reading a book about Batman or when we're dealing with a popular film or a popular text of any kind, right? What we can start to look for are the cues that tell us that support various things about what's normal and what's not normal. And so here is where we can start to question Batman without saying like, haha, he's actually gay or he's actually straight or he's actually whatever we want to claim, because of course he's a comic. He doesn't actually exist. He's not actually in my room right now, and he's definitely not one thing and only one thing. But that's also a very queer understanding, right? That he can be different things to different people at different times, and that's not necessarily wrong. I mean, it gets outside of that paradigm that Batman is or he isn't something. And I think that perspective is something that very few of the comics at the time, very few of the popular discourses, but Batman, the Batman comic books, the detective comic books, help us kind of consider the alternative possibilities of how we can interpret that. There's this kind of funny in this context example that I found looking back in the early comics where Batman puts on these queer lenses. And so there's special glasses that help him see, and he shuts off the lights and he attacks these goons in a building with these glasses that help him see things that other people can't. And I use that in my book to talk about the way that Batman, reading Batman, and kind of getting involved, like beyond simply reading the words or looking at the pictures, but asking what's in between these panels and what is the possible subtext, no matter what you want to read into it, what might be going on between this image and this image, or between this word and that word on the next page. And so, in a way, we can put on these queer glasses and we can see things that are both there and not there, which is one of the really cool things about comics. Batman helps us do that by asking about masculinity itself. I mean, when you think about it, there are a number of interesting claims that Wortham makes. Whether they're accurate or not accurate is a whole other debate, but he points to the fact that he has a very close relationship with Robin, the fact that he's constantly being saved and that they have these tender moments. And I mean, that's not really debatable. I mean, that happens in the books. The question is, how does that affect young people, and what might happen if people read that, and what was the intention behind that? That can all be debated. But Batman presents an interesting case in which you have a bachelor who seems to fall in line with a number of conventions and is often presented with beautiful women that he is supposed to date, but he always pleases them in a way that demonstrates that he's doing it for them, or he's doing it for a society that's watching, not because he's doing it for himself, which also talks about these issues of sort of normalcy, traditional hegemonic masculinity versus alternatives to that. And Batman is an interesting case in which he goes between those. So Queenie is an example of that. Obviously, she's in and out of the Batman world very quickly, but she jumps in the way of a bullet, saves Batman, therefore demonstrating his vulnerability and his contingency. That's an important element as well, right? Batman is actually, if you look at the history, he's taken on a number of characteristics. He wanted, when he was being created, by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, they wanted to make another Superman, but they couldn't because Superman already existed and he was already bright colored and had all of these superpowers. As you know, I'm sure, Batman is kind of the opposite, right? He's darker, he's more solitary, he's more vulnerable in many ways, he's not superhuman. And so, at the same time though, he's always dealing with that image of Superman and contrasting himself. So one of the things that helps to define Batman is his not being Superman, but always being parallel in some way. And I think you could take that and you could say the same about this idea of the hegemonic, perfect man of the time, whether we're talking about 1940s or whether we're talking about 2020. And he's always conscious of that, it seems, the character, but he's never that. He might pretend to be, he might be a striking bachelor, he might be a very strong, heroic, powerful person, but then we always see these other sides where he's vulnerable, where Queenie, as an example again, tries to save him, gets shot and is dying. She requests that he kiss her, and he does, to please her, not to please him. And this is something that you can see over and over again with Catwoman when she's introduced as the Cat, and when she goes on a crime spree and says, if I could just be with Bruce Wayne, I would be happy and therefore I wouldn't have to commit crime. Suddenly Bruce Wayne comes in and woos her as a bachelor, and then they plan to get married. And this is very early, this is not the recent Batman, but at the same time he's doing this to prevent crime from happening in the city. So he's becoming this this groom in order to help Gotham City, not necessarily because he wants to be. This happens with Vicky Vale when she is proposed to by a very powerful foreigner, and she doesn't want to marry this person, but she also doesn't want to upset him. suddenly she says she's going to marry Batman, and they have a secret relationship, and he can't get out of this because if he does, then this guy could get mad and hurt Gotham and its people. So suddenly he pretends to do this, except he's very happy to get out of this at the end, and he celebrates with Robin, having a glass of grade A milk. Now there are many ways that we could interpret this. Alexander Doty's great book, Flaming Classics, is a wonderful example of how you can perform queer readings without necessarily accepting that you're transforming it from a popular text that is not queer into queer for your own personal desires or something, and saying that, well, actually, we shouldn't assume that everything is heterosexual and straight, and that any queer reading is an alternative version of it. Maybe it really is queer, we just don't know it, or we just can't identify it because it's not out there in your face saying, like, this is a queer character. And so I like that idea that we shouldn't assume that all characters are straight until proven otherwise, and we shouldn't assume that all texts are straight until proven otherwise. Instead, I'm also not saying we should do the reverse, by the way, but I think what we can do is take a note from Judith Butler. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with her work on performativity and gender trouble, particularly, as well as a number of other great books that you should definitely check out if you haven't. But she's interested in how we perform this thing, masculinity, femininity, or what have you, because we've sort of seen it and we know that it should be happening, or at least we have this sense that it should be happening, so we perform it very much like Bruce Wayne performs this sort of buffoonish bachelor in many cases who doesn't want to work and who doesn't want to do anything and who's sleeping all day because he's lazy, right? That's the impression that he often gives. And when really he's doing this as a performance so that we don't think he's Batman. I think we could get down to it and say, like, Bruce Wayne is not real in the sense that that's who that person is. That's a performance. But obviously Batman is a performance in order to scare criminals. I mean, that's why he says he wears his getup, as well as to strike fear into superstitious criminals and things like this, right? And in order to become more of a myth than he could be as a regular guy trying to fight crime. So Batman's not him. And so we don't really have him. We could debate this for a long time. I'm sure maybe you have with your friends. Who's the real, is Batman or Bruce Wayne the real person, or how does that work? I think that in general also sets up a great way to think more about how do we work? How do we work as people? How do we interpret ourselves? And how do we interpolate a lot of these things that we see, like this is masculine and I want to be masculine, or this is feminine and I want to be feminine? Batman and Bruce Wayne and the characters that mingle in these books allow us to see performances all the time, which is what Butler argues is happening, right? There's no underneath of the performance. There's always performance. So you could be performing a scholar, you could be performing a fan, you could be performing a straight guy, you could be performing a gay guy. All of these are performances. They're not real in the sense that, underneath it all, this is it. If we look at Batman and move away from what's often spoken of or implied in a lot of the discourses, that he's this Superman type character who is almost invulnerable, and think about just how vulnerable he is and just how vulnerable his performances are when he's often identified, and he's worried about that. He's worried people will find out who he really is. He's worried that he won't be able to fight and continue his struggles. And then he's helped out by people, including a number of women who prevent his death early on, especially in a lot of these situations, as well as his close relationships with people like Alfred, Selina Kyle. They all point to Batman as a vulnerable, contingent personality who is many things and is constantly performing who he is in light of what his society sort of tells him to be, but also questioning that. I mean, he's part of society, but he's a little bit outside society. He is making choices, but he's also not completely autonomous. He can't choose all of the things that are part of his situation. All of this points to a sort of questioning, a queering perhaps, of how we think about the world, and that Batman as a great example, but not by far the only example, of how queer reading of these texts can help us metaphorically sort of put on these queer lenses that allow us to see things that are there, but not clearly or explicitly there, and allow us to think more deeply about the sort of nuanced performances that we are all engaging in throughout our days and throughout our lives. That is, I think, one of the reasons why we can all, to an extent, identify with, and that we all kind of love, Batman and Bruce Wayne. Thank you very much.